Welcome to Freedom Matters. Freedom Matters is a quarterly podcast focusing on challenges to religious freedom in Australia. I'm Michael Stead. I'm the Anglican Bishop of South Sydney and the Chair of Freedom for Faith. I'm joined today by Monica Doumit, who is the Chancellor of the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney and also a board member of Freedom for Faith. Our focus for this episode of the podcast is on hate speech laws and why they are such a challenge to religious freedom. Monica, tell us what's been happening in recent months.
Well, okay, obviously we had the tragedy of the Bondi terrorist attack in December, and there was a natural and right response from government, which was we need to do something about this to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. But what we've seen is the preeminent response has been this influx of hate speech laws at both a federal and state level. In New South Wales, we had the Prohibition on Nazi Symbols, Crimes Amendment Act, and then also a couple of inquiries, one on right-wing extremism and the other into slogans that incite hatred. Then at a federal level, we had the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism Act, and in Queensland, an even more ridiculously named Fighting Anti-Semitism and Keeping Guns Out of the Hands of Criminals Act. That was passed up there. So, yeah, look, there's been a bit going on.
Yeah, but I think it's important to realise that it hasn't just been in the last couple of months. It's really been quite an explosion over the last couple of years. I've plotted this on a graph, as I want to do, and I realised, and you'll see it on the graph, which will come up on the screen in a moment, is that there have been laws that address speech ever since 1989. That was the first anti-vilification laws in Australia. And since then, there's been an average of 0.6 pieces of legislation per year, so 0, 1 or 2, for about 30 years, up until 2023. And then in 2023, 24, at the end of 2023, and then 24, 25, and now into 2026, it skyrockets. And so we've had 6 and 8 and 7 pieces of legislation or inquiries for legislation just in the last couple of years. So there's massive skyrocketing. A lot of it has been driven by the response to what happened in 2023 in October, but it's, I think, the government's attempt to deal with social cohesion issues by passing yet more laws to restrict speech.
Yeah, we'll probably get into this a bit later. I'm not sure that passing laws to tell people what they can say and what they can't say is really a way to bring people together.
No.
But it's interesting, though, because opposing laws that seek to outlaw hate speech is a really strange place to be, obviously, because it's not like we're in favour of hate speech. It's not like we're out there pushing people to say hateful things from pulpits or from microphones or even in private. So how can we understand the ways in which speech is regulated and maybe perhaps should be regulated?
Yeah. I think everyone should agree that there are some kinds of speech that ought to be restricted. I don't know anybody who is a genuine free speech absolutist. That is, you can say whatever you like any old time. Historically, at least in terms of the way that the criminal justice system has responded, there have been 3 types of speech. There has been speech which has been criminal. Most obviously, it's where you use speech to threaten a crime or incite someone else to do a crime. So, and the logic is, if the thing itself is a crime, then threatening to do the crime or inciting somebody else to commit a criminal act should also be criminal, in the same way that conspiracy to murder is the same penalty as murder. If incitement to murder, if I'm telling you, Monica, you really need to go out and kill this person, incitement to violence, threat of violence, Monica, I'm going to kill you, those things have been and are criminal offences. And so I'm very comfortable with the idea that those things should be prohibited. We've had another category of laws, which are not criminal laws, but they are about holding people responsible for the consequences of their speech. And slander laws, so defamation laws, slander and libel. Historically, we've said we're going to hold people accountable. You can't just say whatever you like. If it trashes somebody's reputation, you'll be held accountable for that. And traditionally, vilification laws have fallen into that category. Vilification is incitement to hatred, and this is an important distinction. Incitement to violence, incitement or threatening violence is at a much higher level. Vilification is incitement to hatred. It's where I'm saying things which are causing you or another person to hate a target group, and those kinds of that kind of speech has traditionally been regulated by civil offences, where you have a tribunal who would say, "No, Michael, you can't say those kind of things. That's offensive. You should apologise." They might even fine me for particularly offensive speech that was inciting hatred, but I wouldn't have been thrown in jail for it. So there's two categories of speech. You have speech which is criminal. You have speech for which there is some kind of civil redress, holding people accountable for their speech. And then the third category of speech has been speech which is perhaps awful but not unlawful. And traditionally we've had a wide tolerance of speech which might be offensive speech, it might be stuff that we don't like, but we say, "No, actually, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I defend your right to say it." It goes back to a quote that it's attributed to Voltaire. I don't think he actually said it, but he said, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Probably a summary of what he actually thought. Most of what's now being raised up as hate speech actually fits into that third category, which is speech which is awful but not unlawful. Now, what's been happening is that we've had speech which should never have had any penalty attached to it is now landing up into that second category, the civil category, and laws which previously would have been addressed at that civil category becoming criminal offences.
I think the modern Australian version of the Voltaire quote, isn't it? Who said everyone's got a right to be a bigot or something like that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, George Brandis was trying to defend the idea of free speech as bigotry, and that is historically how we've understood the right to say things which other people find offensive. Now, there have been laws in Australia in the past which have set the bar way too low. So one example is Section 17 of the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act, which has been enforced for a number of years, since I think 2014. This famously is the section that led to Archbishop Porteous being hauled before a tribunal because of making statements, thoroughly outrageous statements about a thoroughly orthodox Catholic position on marriage. You can speak more freely about this.
Oh no! Well, the interesting thing about that is that was one of the two examples in Australia where the law was dealing with what you're putting into category 3, which is so-called awful speech, but not unlawful, but trying to make it unlawful and put it into bucket 2. The other one is obviously 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, because each of those count someone taking offence at speech being enough to make it unlawful. And so I think those are the two examples that we have currently in Australia, that offensive speech had been put into bucket 2. I think what we're seeing with this push to criminalise so-called hate speech is actually now they're trying to take them all the way from bucket 3 and throw them into bucket 1, which is criminal behaviour. Absolutely.
And so now it's not just Archbishop Porteous before a tribunal and all of that painful process. It's actually the Archbishop in jail for 5 years. That's the stakes are so much higher by making it so what we've been talking about is criminal vilification for hate speech, and that's been the spectre of most recent laws.
Okay, well, it's helpful to understand why they're problematic. So that's what's been happening at sort of a New South Wales level. Can we talk a little bit about what happened federally? Yeah, so that's a really good example of this overreach. The federal government introduced the Combating Anti-Semitism and Hate Speech Bill, and it contained a provision section 82BF, which would have added into the Commonwealth Crimes Code an offence, a criminal offence, which was related to offensive speech. Now, I better quote it exactly, but making it was a criminal offence to promote hatred of a target group
that leads to conduct that would cause a reasonable person in that target group to be, now listen to this, intimidated, fear harassment or violence, or fear for their safety. And so it all turns on the subjective response of a member of the target group. And so in this case, if it was a member of the Jewish community who would say, I feel that I might get harassed because of what you're saying, that's enough for you to be thrown in jail. I fear for my safety because of what you are saying. If you are saying this thing, I don't think it's safe to go outside anymore. And so suddenly this has become a criminal offence, punishable by 2 to 5 years in prison.
So it's not even about the incitement of violence, it's the incitement almost of fear. And is there a rationality test to that? Like, should their fear be reasonable, or is it just a subjective?
So it's a reasonable member of the target group. So it's not quite reasonable. It's saying if you are a member of the Jewish community, in my example, or another targeted group, if you, as a reasonable person, would feel intimidated or fearful, and it actually defines, it says that fear includes apprehension. So if I just have the apprehension of violence, that's enough to trigger this offence.
And that now becomes criminal behaviour on the part of the person. So
the good news is that Section 82BF was taken out of the legislation. There's other parts of the legislation which got up which aren't great, but this was by far the very worst part of it. In its original form, it only applied to the protected category of race, but because the government had signalled its willingness to expand this, not just to race, but all other protected attributes, that would have been potentially disastrous for Christian speech, because it's conceivable that Christians would say things that members of a target group might feel apprehensive about. Especially if we're saying if you live that way, you won't go to heaven. And you're saying, well, wouldn't you be afraid of going to hell? That's enough to trigger a criminal offence.
I mean, well, I imagine if Christians weren't speaking like that in some circumstances, then we wouldn't necessarily be doing our job.
That's right.
Particularly for someone like a bishop. If a bishop stopped warning people of eternal consequences of their actions.
Yes, I wouldn't be doing my job as a bishop. I think it's okay, everyone's going to go to heaven. It doesn't matter what you do. No, actually, there are consequences for our actions eternally. And drawing that to people's attention, even if I do it sensitively and pastorally and all those kind of things, that would be enough to land us in deep water with these criminal offences. That's why there's such a risk to religious freedom.
It's an interesting thing too, because I also think that, like you, I don't think that necessarily Christians are at risk from the current laws around the incitement of racial hatred, because I don't think that's something we're often accused of, but often we're accused of being hateful in other circumstances. Yep. But even so, just on the racial stuff, it's really bad jurisprudence, because the thing about criminal law is that it has to be certain. You have to have, and you and I were both involved in a New South Wales Law Reform Commission inquiry into the introduction of hate speech laws a couple of years ago. And that's one of the things the New South Wales Law Reform Commission said. They said that the subjective nature of hatred and what it means, and how people often will throw things around as that's hate speech and that's hate speech and that's hateful, that criminal law, in order to be just, has to be measurable. If something's going to land me in prison, I need to know exactly where the guardrails are. But if it's on a subjective concept like hatred, then it becomes really unjust, and it throws our legal system into a completely different category. We're crossing a line there, I think, because you're introducing such a subjective test into the criminal law, which is supposed to be certain.
That's right. And I think the disappointing thing is the government is moving so fast that they're not even waiting to hear the results of their own inquiries. So you mentioned that the SACA review, it came back and said, no, don't go in this direction. The government's already gone in that direction before they've got the results of that review. The parliamentary inquiry into the government's bill, the Combating Anti-Semitism and Hate Speech, they'd already introduced the bill before they'd received the report from the committee. It was ridiculously short. The committee was called one day. It started taking hearings the next day. It only took hearings for 1.5 days. Final submissions were due the following day, and the legislation was introduced in Parliament the next day, and the committee didn't report until 3 days after. And you think, well, what was the point of that?
Exactly right. It's giving the veneer of consultation without actually giving any consultation at all. Can we go back to the Commonwealth Bill for a minute?
Yeah.
Because you did say that while Section 82.2BF was removed, and that was a good thing, there were a couple of items in there that I think are particularly challenging and I think we need to be aware of. The first I would say is that there is now a separate aggravated offence for religious leaders, faith leaders. So if you were to say something on this podcast that was deemed to be, I think, inciting violence, and I was to say the exact same thing on this exact same podcast, you'd get a higher penalty than I would because you're a religious leader. And it's interesting because there's no measure in that for the size of your influence. You could be a religious leader of a small community church that has 20 congregants on a Sunday, and still you would potentially face a more extreme threat than, I don't know, a radio shock jock or someone like that who said the same thing. So it's not... Yes, while I do concede that faith leaders can often have a significant amount of influence, that's not always true. I mean, as a bishop, you know that you have some influence, and you know there are things you might really want to influence and you can't. Whereas you might have a particular TikTok influencer who has much more reach and much more influence than you do. So I think it's a really difficult thing when you have laws that treat religious leaders separately because they are religious leaders. Now, don't get me wrong. I think you should be held to a higher standard than I do, but that's a matter of faith and not necessarily a matter for the civil law. Yeah,
certainly not for aggravated sentencing for criminal offences, which is where this cuts in. And it's, as you say, it is a particularly targeting of religious leaders. You could have another leader, so you could have the leader of an alt-right neo-Nazi group or something like that who could say the same kind of inflammatory thing. I would get a higher penalty simply because I'm a religious leader and he's a different kind of leader. And you think, this is a very strange place for us to be in Australia.
Yeah, our famous sports stars, any of those could have, but it would be you. So I think that we need to be very, very wary of the law holding religious leaders to a higher standard just because it deems that you should be punished worse.
We have special laws in Australia where we I wouldn't say bend the rules. We the ordinary principles of presumptions and principles of investigation and attributing blame are drawn much more widely with the terrorist-related groups, and so and that's because we recognise that there are particular kinds of threats arising from these terrorist groups. What the hate group provisions in this Act do are effectively creating another way for a group that wouldn't meet the threshold of being a terrorist group, nonetheless to be able to make that group illegal. And the risk here is, like right at the moment, they've only prescribed 2 groups. Neither of them are religious in nature, but in the hands of a different government, because it's based on ministerial discretion, you could end up with Christian groups being banned as hate groups because they say things which are hateful to a particular target group in the community because they teach certain things which are offensive, say, to the trans community or something like that. It's not inconceivable that this hate group idea could be expanded to prohibit certain kinds of unacceptable so-called Christian hate speech.
Yeah, well, exactly, because in the legislation, in the objects of why they introduced this particular set of provisions, one of the things it says is it's in order to protect the community against physical, psychological, social or economic harm. So this isn't about, I mean, the terror groups are really supposed to be protecting against a particular threat, which is mass violence, right? Yeah. Violence on a massive scale, and that's why...
That's why we're prepared to drop the rules.
We're prepared to lower the standard because letting one of those things through, it has catastrophic results. But if I don't even know what social harm means, that just sounds like such a low threshold. I mean, if I don't invite you to my birthday party because you're an Anglican and I'm a Catholic, is that social harm? I mean, my parties are awesome. But this idea of like you're lowering and you're equating that with terrorism, I think is really troubling. The other thing that's in there is that there's it specifically says that sort of the principles of natural justice don't apply or due process don't apply or something like that. And it's not only those members of the group or the leaders of the group who are the ones that are targeted by this, but it's also supporters. And so if, for example, you were to donate to one of these organisations, you could find yourself with equivalent criminal penalties to funding a terrorist organisation. So I think this is a real sleeper issue that we're going to have to watch, particularly if, as you say, they start expanding the categories from race into other protected attributes. So I think that's really problematic as well.
Indeed. So, although it was a great win to have Section 82BF removed, it didn't turn a bad bill into a good bill. It just turned a bad bill into a slightly less bad bill, or a slightly less bad act. But it's not the only issue. Although we successfully managed to prevent criminal vilification laws at a federal level, there are in fact two laws, criminal vilification laws in Australia now, one in New South Wales, one in Victoria. The New South Wales one is narrowly constrained, so Section 93ZAA of the Crimes Act only applies to race. And in its current form, as you said earlier, it's not something that Christians are likely to get caught up by. However, the principle is wrong, that it's now creating a criminal offence for something which should only ever have been a civil offence. And the real risk is if what's presently limited to race gets expanded out to other protected attributes, you run the risk that Christian speech is going to get caught up.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think just from a principled level, and take it away from the law for a moment, I think that we think the best way to challenge speech like that, which what you described before well, I think, which is awful but not unlawful, is that you should challenge it publicly. People should come out and call it out and debate it and engage in that discourse, not only, I guess, for the sake of the individuals involved, but also to educate the public and to form the public. By just trying to silence everything like this and all types of this type of contentious debate, we're actually losing something, I think, as a society. We're not learning how to debate well without it escalating into violence. If the goal is social cohesion, then by suppressing speech, you're just you risk turning people towards more extreme acts rather than actually letting them have it out publicly in as much rage with as much rage and passion as possible.
Yeah, I agree. I think that these moves, though well-intentioned, are likely to produce the opposite result, that they'll actually further polarise our society. They will drive people into not just extreme speech, but actually speech which is then leads to extreme action. So there are real negative consequences to pushing too hard or with the criminalisation of speech. An example of that, I think, is what has happened in Victoria. So whereas in New South Wales the criminal vilification provisions are still narrowly constrained, in Victoria since September of last year they've been expanded out. They apply to all protected attributes, and again I'll quote it so I don't overstate it. The new serious vilification offence is if a person says or does something that could incite hatred against, contempt for, revulsion towards or severe ridicule of another person or group. So that inciting hatred, contempt or revulsion or severe ridicule, that's traditionally been the language of that would qualify you for civil sanctions. This is now moved what was in the number 2 bucket back into the number 1 bucket. And as I said, and that's for all of the protected attributes. We've gone to a subjective test and it's a harms-based test. The two things that the New South Wales Law Reform Commission said don't do because it makes the criminal law uncertain. And how do I know how the target group is going to react to something that I've said? That's exactly where we've landed in Victoria.
And I think if we look overseas as well, the problems with including some of these types of provisions is that you turn into a nanny state. You might have the stats better than I do in the UK. How many arrests are there?
Yeah, so 30 arrests a day for communications-based offences. And so this is people posting stuff in Twitter and WhatsApp and Facebook. And then the police get called because of something that somebody's read online and taking offence. So 30 arrests a day. In addition, there's almost as many prosecutions under the Public Order Act, so 11,000 in 2024-25, and these relate to one group of the community alleging that they have been offended by another, and it's been, as it's played out against Christians, it's been trans activists who've said they've been offended by street preachers, and there've been people who've been convicted on that basis, or it's been Muslim groups who've taken action against Christians because they've been offended by what the Christian has said about the Quran or the Prophet Muhammad. So when you have a bar which is based on offence, as we saw with Archbishop Porteous, it opens what it does is actually encourages polarisation of the community, and it encourages one group in the community to sic the police on the other group as a way of regulating speech I don't like.
Yeah, how's that work for social cohesion?
Yeah, and you think, what's that done? Like, something that was designed to promote cohesion has actually just led to community fracture. Because
what it does is it gives people an easy weapon to use against those who they find offend them. I remember reading one example of a 15-year-old girl, neurodivergent, whose friend had been killed in a car accident. And so she posted on her Instagram page some rap lyrics that included some offensive language to about her 100 followers. And she ended up being arrested, and I think she's wearing an ankle bracelet or something like that. Yeah. The actual maker of the song is free and clear because he's in the US. But I think when you've got 15-year-old girls in ankle bracelets for posting rap lyrics, I think we've gone a little bit too far. Absolutely. And and I'm worried generally as a free speech, for the principles of free speech. I think the antidote to bad speech is good speech. And as you say, if you're offended by a street preacher in Hyde Park, the whole point is you go and you stand up on your soapbox next to him and you say, no, you're wrong, not call the police and get the police to arrest the guy. That's why they're on the street, and that's why they're preaching on the street, right. So you will engage with them. Yeah. Now, we've been speaking a lot about hate speech, and as I said, I think this is one of the, I was going to say it's a sleeper issue. It's not a sleeper issue anymore. It's very much awake, and it's something that Christians need to be alert to, is that what looks like good laws to deal with a bad social problem actually have a really negative consequence. And so when people hear criminal vilification, you should take watch. There's one other thing that's just re-emerged, which is another one of these take watch moments. Do you want to tell us about that? Sure. So last year, the Greens in New South Wales tabled a human rights bill for New South Wales, and there has been this push in multiple jurisdictions, including at a federal level, that we have a human rights charter or a human rights act, Bill of Rights, those types of things. And the rhetoric we will hear is that, well, we're the only Western country without such a charter and things like that. And so we have to have one to guarantee rights. And so New South Wales, the Greens in New South Wales have proposed this human rights bill. And we did think that it wasn't going anywhere. But in the last couple of days, it's been pushed to a parliamentary inquiry, which means that we'll be writing another round of submissions, probably appearing before a parliamentary committee. But the problem with human rights bills as their modern day inception is that they don't seem to actually enforce human rights as they're outlined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or even in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What usually happens is they water down things like freedom of religion and parental rights and things like that, and elevate rights that are either very low down or non-existent in these, like the right of equality, or the right against non-discrimination, which I think is something like Article 26 and has all of these caveats to it. It's now becomes the preeminent right over and above everything else. And so I think I would be fine if they were implementing the ICCPR as it exists in international law, but they don't. They want to modernise it, and usually they try to measure these rights, against reasonable, modern standards of what we understand rights to be, which is code for basically anything except religion.
That's right. And the Greens bill in particular, not only does it do what most of these bills do, which is to diminish religious freedom rights and elevate other rights at the expense of religion, but it actually creates novel, unworkable human rights. So it talks about a right to clean water and a right to housing. Like, what does that actually mean? Does the government's going to have to provide clean water, and there's an action against the government if we don't have clean water? The bill, when the bill was introduced by the Greens, they admitted as much, that this was an ambit claim bill, and they didn't expect to see most of these rights actually in the final version. But even so, this is the bill that's now been referred to an inquiry. So this just feels like we're going to have another round of making submissions to demonstrate why what's purported to enhance human rights is actually going to detract from them, but certainly from religious rights. So watch this space, more details to come.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I will say is that there are a couple of jurisdictions in Australia that have Bills of Rights. So Victoria has a Charter of Rights, so does the ACT.
Yeah.
And for anyone who wants to know how these work, Victoria had its Charter of Rights during the most severe COVID lockdowns in all over the world. And if anyone remembers those pictures of, the riot squad marching through Queen Victoria markets and things like that, certainly people's human rights weren't necessarily protected there.
And the ACT had their charter, and notwithstanding that, they were able to forcibly acquire a Catholic hospital and just rip out the Catholic underpinning of that institution. So, there's every indication that these charters do nothing to protect religious freedom, and in fact go a long way to undermining it.
Absolutely.
Well, Monica, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure as always, and I look forward to our next podcast together. This has been Freedom Matters. Thank you.